Hey, what's up, StaelTek here, and welcome to a brand new video. Today we will be taking a look at an old beast, the Geforce GTX 670. Can you still play games in 2020? Well, let's find out. So the GTX 670 was launched in early 2012 for a price of around $350 to $400 US. It was meant to compete with the Radeon HD 7950. Back in the day, this card was actually very impressive. It was based on the brand new Kepler architecture, which was succeeding the Fermi architecture such as from the GTX 480 and GTX 580, and it was also a lot less power consuming, which is already very apparent because it's only using two 6-pin power connectors. Now this is specifically the reference model. I bought this one for about $35 including shipping, secondhand by the way. So this one gives me a very good representation of what this card can do on the stock condition. Speaking of stock conditions, this one is an MSI pre-overclocked model. So it has a factory overclock, but today I'm not gonna overclock it because I have tried for, I believe, like 2 days probably, and it's not very happy with overclocking. I do suspect it's because of a very weak VRM system, but it is what it is. In terms of features, it can enable up to 3-way SLI by the use 2 SLI fingers. That was at the time when SLI actually kinda makes sense. It really doesn't anymore. But in theory, you can put 3 GTX 670s under the same PC case basically. When it comes to I/O, it has a HDMI port, a DisplayPort output, and dual DVI outputs, and you can fit up to 3 displays simultaneously with a single card. It also features, as the first one from Nvidia anyway, it has a PCI Express 3.0 16x slot. And this particular model has a very short PCB, as you can see. It's around here. It ends around here though. So those who were at least gaming on a GTX 670 at the time, and even a 660 for that matter, even though that didn't make a whole lot of sense, you could technically custom water cool those and still have a sick gaming rig. I actually fondly remember, I believe it was Linus Tech Tips or NSI Tech Tips that used a GTX 670 because it was very easy to water cool. It doesn't consume a whole lot of power, at least relative to at the time. And it was also a pretty short PCB, so you can even make a pretty decent ITX custom water cooling loop. But enough of that channel, let's get into some specs. It was released in 2012. It's based on a GK104 die on TSMC's 28nm architecture. This specific model has a factory overclock, but I will list the stock base clocks at the time for GTX 670. And it has 2 GB of GDDR5 memory clocked at 6 GHz, and that's on a 256-bit wide memory bus. It has a TDP of around 150 watts, and that's because you do see those 2 6-pin power connectors, although you could technically get it to work with a single 6-pin power connector, but you're really on the edge when it comes to the power requirements, because you do not want to go over the specs of these 6-pin power connectors, and especially not the PCI Express slot, especially for lower end motherboards and power supplies, but that's an entirely different discussion. Now, right off the bat, you can really tell that this card is not really meant for extreme overclocking. First of all, this one really shows how much care that has been done by the manufacturers for graphics cards, because the RAM chips, at least half of them, are actually on the back side, and there's virtually no cooling whatsoever for these bad boys. The rest of them is internally, but I did open up very quickly just to check everything was all good and good to go, and also dusting it off because, well, that's kind of mandatory when you secondhand shop things to take care of them. But it really doesn't have great cooling. I mean, yeah, it has a dedicated VRM heatsink. I don't know if you can actually see it. I think you can see it through the grill here, but that's just hot exhausted air, so it's not the best out there for sure. So with that being said, how is it using today? Well, first of all, it still uses pretty modern features. You can still use dynamic super resolution, even though it's kind of dumb to use that on a 670, but hey, you can technically do it. It also supports up to 4K resolutions with the DisplayPort output. You have shadow play recording, which is, by the way, what I'm gonna be using for all of my benchmark recordings. So with that being said, let's get into some games and see how well it has aged. And you probably need some popcorn because it hasn't aged that well, but I'm gonna get ahead of myself. Let's get into some benchmarks. Let's get started with some benchmarks. The specs are as follows. The Intel Core i7-4770K at 4.4 GHz with 16 GB of DDR3 memory running at 1866 MHz. The latest drivers from Nvidia are used, and we are using the Windows 2H20 update. So let's get started. First off, let's start with some 3D Mark Time Spy, which is unfortunately the only overclocked benchmark I actually have due to the instability on the graphics card. But we can see just from the graphics score alone that it was potentially getting over 15% higher performance. But that's all about it. Let's get into some games. Let's start off with some Battlefield 5. Now this game can be extremely demanding, and honestly it's a bit too demanding if I'm gonna be honest compared to Battlefield 1. But with low settings at 1080p resolution, we were able to get 64.5 FPS average and a 1% low of 50.2. Honestly, it's not too bad, and if you're just gonna try the game maybe once or twice, or perhaps just playing some normal multiplayer such as TDM perhaps, then it should not be an issue. I will personally avoid playing with larger maps in multiplayer. Next up, we have GTA 5, which is a very common game to use, especially from those from the GTX 600, 700 and 900 series graphics cards. Here we're using the high settings with FXAA enabled at 1080p resolution, and we were able to achieve 111.3 FPS average with a 1% low of 74.4. This game was playing extremely smoothly, and although the VRAM is pretty much maxed out as you can see on the footage, it was overall a very smooth experience, and personally it plays very nicely. Next up, we are going Insane Trilogy. Okay, that was a bad joke. We are using Crash Bandicoot Insane Trilogy, as this was very close to the minimum requirements, in big air quotes, to this game. And we were able to use ultra settings without motion blur at 1080p resolution, and honestly it may not look too badly on the recording, but unfortunately as soon as you bounce off the 60 FPS limiter, the game really becomes very messy. But we did achieve a respectable 56.7 FPS average, but with a 1% low of 33.7. So if you want to play this game, you are, by the way, you are totally entitled to do so. I would personally recommend locking it to 30 FPS for a more smooth experience. Next up, we have Red Dead Redemption 2, which is an insanely demanding game for this GTX 670. In fact, due to the lack of VRAM, 2 GB of that, it cannot run it at 1080p resolution. I was actually forced to only run it at 1600 by 900 resolution. Even with no FXAA enabled at low settings with 900p resolution, we were getting an average frame rate of 33.9 and a 1% low of 22.1. And honestly, this game is borderline playable, especially if you are more used to the more crowded areas. It's probably not the best card to play this game on. I would much rather pick up a Radeon 7950 or 7970. I will get back to that in a few minutes. Next up, we have Counter-Strike Global Offensive, or CSGO. Here we're using the lowest settings with FXAA enabled at 1080p resolution, and I got an average frame rate of 269.3 FPS with a 1% low of 25. Keep in mind those 1% low is when there is a lot of smoke in this benchmark map, so it's probably closer to like 150 to probably the high 100s, maybe low 200s normally. Overall, it's a very solid performer, and you should not have a problem poning some noobs. Moving on to newer games, we're using Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2019, which until very recently was the newest Call of Duty available. Now keep in mind that this game is extremely demanding on the CPU and GPU, but we were able to run at 51 FPS average with a 1% low of 34.4 at the lowest possible settings at 1080p resolution. So if you do want to play this game, I will highly recommend turning down the resolution to something along the lines of 1280 by 720 or 1366 by 768 and forget all about Warzone. I'm sorry to say, but you should probably just stick to smaller maps. And last but certainly not least, we have Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War, which ironically was the reason why I bought this GTX 670, but that's an entirely different story though. But it is listed as the official minimum requirements to run this game, but at the lowest possible settings at 1080p resolution, no anti-aliasing, filters or anything, I was getting an average frame rate of 41.6 FPS and a 1% of 19.4. So it is borderline playable, and honestly you should probably turn it down to 1280 by 720 resolution or something along those lines. With that being said, back to the camera. So there you have it, those were the numbers for the Geforce GTX 670. As you can see, it is mostly playable on the lowest possible details and not always at full HD resolution. I know there has been a few videos about the Kepler architecture, which by the way is the 600 and 700 series cards, talking about the lack of aging and also lack of optimization when it comes to FPS numbers comparing to AMD's fine wine technology, which, I mean, that's a pretty old meme at this point, but that really just tells you how badly aged that card is, because my Radeon 7970, I will link it up here somewhere, it is in Danish, but you can just look through the video and hopefully see the numbers, be like, oh okay, that actually doesn't look so bad. But with that being said, should you go out and buy a Geforce GTX 670? So as of recording right now, and I'm recording on the 21st of November 2020, I'm gonna punch in GTX 670, which by the way there will be some filler in here. And I can see that most people are selling them for around $60 to $70. I'm gonna tell you right now, for $60 to $70, it's not worth your time. This specific model, which by the way, that is the worst case scenario with this terrible cooler that there is on it, but I bought it just to keep it as original as possible. It's not very good performing. It does consume a hell of a lot more power, contrary to a GTX 1050 for example. But let's say you're getting a good deal, let's say $20, maybe $30. You're kind of pushing it at $30, but for about $20-$30 you can definitely get it to work. But other than that, no, not really. I will not advise you to get this card. You might as well get a GTX 680 or a Radeon 7950. Those will cost maybe a touch more, but they will deliver a lot more performance, especially the Radeon 7950 with its 3GB VRAM frame buffer. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video. Like the video if you liked it, dislike it if you absolutely hated it. Subscribe today if you loved it. Please check out my Discord server and my Facebook page. Those will be linked in the description. And with that being said, I'm out of here. Thanks for watching.